since before recorded history, the people of Britain have had first-hand experience of the strange and unusual. Spirits who haunt ancient castles, stories of werewolves and banshees roaming the countryside, and fantastic creatures like gnomes, fairies and pixies, all firmly embedded in our native folklore. This cultural experience makes us uniquely qualified to research these types of phenomena and help us find the truth of the reality that surrounds us. So sit back and relax as your hosts, Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, take you on a journey through this strange realm and together help us find the answers to the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host for tonight, Mark Johnson, and joining me is our co-host, Andy Mercer. How you doing, Andy?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you very much. It's nice to be back on the air with you guys again.
Yes, it is. And I do want to mention our other host, Irene Allen Block. She wasn't able to make it tonight, but she should be back next week. So, Irene, I know you just got tied up with a few things, but we'll look forward to having you back next week. So this is a new year. We're now in 2018. And, you know, I kind of looked around and still kind of looks like 2017 to me. I don't know. haven't seen much of a difference yet. How about you?
Not really, no. It's a bit chilly here. It's dull, grey, a bit of rain. It's not much has really changed to what it was the last week or the week before, though, of course, it's been a little different for me because I've been away into another part of the world and getting very, very cold indeed.
Yes.
In your good old New York.
Yes. Well, you were actually in my neighborhood. I was only an hour away, and I know we were planning to try to hook up, but unfortunately, I got so bloody sick. I got the worst cold, which was making the rounds out here. And I was sick for over a week and a half, and the whole time you were out here. So unfortunately, I wouldn't have been able to meet you. But, you know, you got to do your first trip to New York City. How'd you like it?
It was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It's the second time I've been. I went originally 14 years ago for my honeymoon. We went for Thanksgiving, which back in those days, in the UK, we didn't have Black Friday. So I had no idea what Black Friday was until I was there and discovered Black Friday and was horrified at the sheer number of people everywhere. Half of America seemed to arrive in New York. But this time it was for Christmas, which was pretty interesting, I have to say. I was expecting New York to be like totally overboard with Christmas everywhere, and it wasn't. I was actually quite surprised, but it was incredibly cold for me. I mean, I'm from the southeast of the UK, as you know, and it gets cold here, but never that cold. But it was the coldest I think I've ever experienced just walking around the streets. And I think it was like -17 at one point, which was pretty chilly for me. So, but no, I really enjoyed it. We were lucky to escape just before the snow arrived, so it wasn't too difficult getting out and about. But when I first arrived, it was mild and raining, but within a week it was absolutely freezing. But I don't know, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, got to see all the sites this time because last time everything was booked up way in advance. Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, all those things I wanted to see, didn't get to. So this time I actually saw them all. It was fantastic.
Fantastic.
So, as I say, we were going to meet up, Mark, but unfortunately my time schedule got kind of full of lots of things to do, and you weren't doing too well, unfortunately.
No, well, did you get a chance to go see the Christmas tree in Rockefeller Center?
Well, my wife actually got to ice skate on the ice at the Rockefeller Center. I didn't. I'm not into ice skating, so I sat and watched. But yeah, her and a friend of hers had a chance to have a whiz around on the ice itself. So that was one of her dreams. So.
Oh, fantastic! Well, I'm glad you had a really good time. I love the city. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and there's always this natural rivalry between New York and Los Angeles as the big cities on each coast. And yet when I moved out here, I found I really enjoyed Manhattan. And everything from Central Park all the way down to the financial district. And, you know, it's just something about it. I don't know what it is. It's just so amazing and how people live there. And I don't think I could do it because I enjoy my freedom too much and getting out into the country. But there is a certain appeal to it. There's a certain appeal about living and working in the city. Seeing so many people do it, it's just, man, does it get crowded. You used to see it on Fleet Week when all the tall ships come in from the U.S. Navy and the city is overrun with sailors. The women all like it.
I can imagine. Well, I must admit, having lived in London as well as now visiting New York, they are similar, except I understand when American tourists in London say how crowded it feels because the streets of New York are much wider, much more open. A lot of people about, there's a lot more space to move. London will, to anybody who's not been to London before, will seem incredibly cramped compared to New York. So I understand when they say that now, they find a bit of a squash, because it is.
When they laid the city out, the city streets, I mean, in the early days, the lower part of Manhattan is very much like London. It's smaller streets, much crowded, not a lot of rhyme or reason to them. But later on, when the city was starting to get so big and they built the upper streets, they made them nice and very wide. So for all the traffic and all the people living there. So, it's just one of those really interesting places to visit. If anybody who's never had a chance to visit New York, get a chance, do it. It's definitely worth your while. So, I hope you had, otherwise besides the trip, I hope you had a wonderful Christmas holiday.
Oh, absolutely. It kind of strangely passed us by being away in New York. We saw the basketball on Christmas Day rather, which is rather fantastic. So that was no Christmassy type stuff at all, which is wonderful for me because I'm not a big fan of Christmas. But it kind of strangely passed by. So it almost feels like I've not had a Christmas. But it was different and it was good, definitely.
Well, before we get started with our show tonight, I do want to say we have a couple of announcements I'm very excited to announce. The biggest of which is I'm very pleased to announce that Irene, for many years, she ran her group, Spirit Rescue International. She ran it from about 1975 to about 2013, at which point she retired, took a long, much-needed break. And, for those of you who know Spirit Rescue International, we talked about it a few weeks ago when we did the show about Sunny, one of our former members. What a great organization it is in helping people with their paranormal issues all around the world. And helping also rescue those spirits and having them move over. Now, because of that show, it really inspired us. After having a long talk with Irene, we decided to bring it back. And so now Spirit Rescue International has awoken from its long slumber, and we are now back in business. Now, Irene, because she retired, she has decided to take more of a consulting role and a step back. She'll be our figurehead and consult with us. I'm going to be running the day-to-day operations. We have many of our old crew is back with us. And we are going to move forward from here. So if anybody who wants to check out the website, it's Spirit Rescue INT for international, spiritrescueint.com. You can go out to our website if you have any information. If you are suffering from paranormal issues and you need help, you can contact us through the website. And for people who aren't familiar with Spirit Rescue International, we're different than a lot of other groups in that we are able to work virtually. There is absolutely no charge ever for our services. We also work with local teams if we're not local ourselves and we need a team to do an on-site investigation, we can make those arrangements. But we also utilize a lot of different tools to remotely view and handle issues on these locations. In the past, I think we've done cases all around the world, even as far away as New Zealand. So it's really exciting, and it's something that I've always wanted to be more involved with. So we're really excited to make that announcement. So Spirit Rescue International is back, and you can find more information at spiritrescueint.com. The second announcement is kind of in relation to that, is I have also brought back my old local research group here in New Jersey called North Jersey Paranormal Research. And my entire team is back. I'm really happy to have the gang all back together, and we're going to be doing more physical on-site research throughout the tri-state area with New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, all in that northern area, and doing the old research that we used to do. And you can see a lot of our old cases at our website at njpresearch.com. And once again, all of our investigations are 100% free of charge. So, two very exciting announcements, getting back into the paranormal research directly, and also helping people who have had issues and actually being able to do something about it. Where a lot of groups come in, they'll investigate, maybe do a one and done, tell the clients, yep, we think this is what you got. Okay, thanks a lot, bye. And then they go home and the people still have to deal with it. So now we have resources at our disposal to actually offer real help. So I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, sounds excellent.
So, okay, enough of my blabbering. Let's get on with the show, and really excited to introduce our guest for tonight. Our guest is a archaeologist and author, and he is a friend of mine as well. He's been working on this book for a very long time, compiling it, putting it together, and now the book is ready and is coming out. In fact, I believe it's already out now, called Ages of the Giants, A Cultural History of the Tall Ones in Prehistoric America. So we'd like to welcome Jason Jarrell to the program. How are you tonight, Jason?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the program.
Well, thanks for coming on. And I do want to be accurate in mentioning that you also co-wrote this book with your wife, Sarah Farmer. So I want to give Sarah the credit there.
That's correct.
Now, this is an interesting premise, and I'll be honest with you, this is one that I had struggled with for a very long time. Mainly because there never seemed to be any concrete proof. And then I read your book, the early manuscripts on your book. And with that, I really had my eyes totally wide open to the subject and thinking there really is a lot of evidence out there. So let me ask you this. First of all, what made you interested in researching the topic of giants in North America?
Well, I actually learned to read at a very young age, and the books that my mother taught me to read with were all books on mythology and also the Holy Bible, ancient Egypt. And so growing up from the earliest age that I can remember, I've always sort of lived in a world where mythological concepts abound. And a couple of decades ago, I stumbled on some articles written by a friend of mine, Ross Hamilton. And Ross was writing about these people who are probably more appropriately referred to as the tall ones, who in ancient American history, they were exceptionally large, powerfully built individuals. And his articles had a couple of instances wherein these remains were found by mainstream archaeologists. And so about a decade ago, Sarah and I found ourselves living here in West Virginia, where a large number of these remains were found in the ancient burial mounds. And so we decided to launch our own investigation. And early on, we realized that the remains actually were discovered. We realized that there was a reality behind this sort of modern mythology. And we decided to take a somewhat different path than the one usually followed with this type of inquiry. What I decided to do was to envelop myself in archaeology and see what we could learn about these ancient people from actual excavation reports and archaeological studies. There's a common commonly held view among a lot of people today that these ancients exist on the other side of some type of veil that prevents us from actually knowing anything about them. However, this is completely wrong. The cultures who buried these individuals in their tombs are ongoing subjects of intense studies every year. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers published on these cultures every year. So I set about finding out what we could learn about them, and it turned out to be a great deal, actually. The title of the book is Ages of the Giants because we utilized archaeology to identify 4 major ancient American cultures that had the tall ones among them, and cross-referenced with the radiocarbon dating sequence, we were able to construct a timeline which spans roughly 4000 BC to 450 AD. And the book provides a complete overview and description of the cultures that these people participated in. And like it says, as you mentioned before, there were numerous antiquarians, Smithsonian agents, and even mainstream archaeologists who found and documented these remains all the way up to the 1980s.
Here's what really gets me is the fact that archaeologists have found traces of these burials, and newspaper articles have been printed in mainstream newspapers. And yet, if you were to go up to the average person on the street and ask them about giants living in America, they think your cheese had slid off your cracker. And nobody believes it. They just think it's a fantasy. And yet we have some evidence. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that first of all, I should point out that it's very true that a number of the newspaper articles are frauds. However, as we documented in the book, many of the newspaper articles can be verified with primary sources, and we actually did that with a number of the press reports. We found the primary sources, the site that the discovery came from. We found the measurements of the skeletons by experts. In one instance, we have one large skeleton that the press reported it as 6 inches shorter than the Smithsonian agent recorded in his field diary. But the big reason probably is that these remains, when people think of the term giant, a lot of people are thinking something from a fairy tale, something 20 or 30 feet tall. The tall ones in North America, which is the term by which Native American elders refer to them, and also by which the Sioux scholar Vine Deloria Jr. referred to them, actually represent a subpopulation that ranged between 7 and 9 feet in height. And I think that perhaps the reality behind this sort of mythology, it may put people off when they see what the reality is. It may not match what a lot of people think of as a giant, but we do know that this was a distinct segment of the ancient population for thousands of years. And it's as the archaeologist Don Dragoo pointed out in 1963, we really have no way of knowing exactly how many people had this unique anthropology due to the widespread practice of cremation. However, Dragoo did observe that many bones found among cremated burials also possessed traits of what he referred to as unique physical types.
Well, you know, between people or a race of people between 7 and 9 feet tall, I mean, there are cultures around the world that have varying degrees of heights within the genetics of that community. You have in Africa alone, on one end of the scale, you have the pygmies, who are average between 4 to 5 feet tall. They're very small people. And then on the other side, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the Watusi, or the Zulus. It's the Zulus who are very tall on average, between 6 and 7 feet tall. Now, a 7-foot tall person, and I've run into people that are about that tall, that's a huge person. Okay, I'm sorry. Now, if you have an entire community of people who average between 7 and 9 feet tall, I'm sorry, 9 feet tall is a freaking giant. I'm sorry. I'm at 5'9", and I'd be looking way up at this person. I'm going, yeah, okay, he's a giant.
Well, it's important to remember that these people were living alongside a base population that ranged between 5'4" and 5'10" or 11. So, living contemporaneously, in other words, with people of average stature, and the persistence of this physical type in North American prehistory seems to indicate to me that there is something to this mystery for sure. There are other features of these skeletons besides height. For example, they had massive lower jaw bones that, in many instances, the early settlers that found these skeletons were able to place the jaw bones over their faces like a mask. There are frequently encountered supernumerary teeth. I have some scientific reports here of as many as 4 extra teeth in the jaws of some of the skeletons. But you just mentioned several excellent examples of different types of people. What's happening is that's probably the case here. And over the years, so much sensationalism has been heaped onto this subject that a lot of people just take a hands-off approach to it.
Well, the differences that you just mentioned. Now, I've also heard stories, and you can confirm this or not with your research, of not only the extra teeth, but I've heard some cases of jaws being found with double rows of teeth.
Well, I have seen a lot of those. I published a couple of those accounts in the book. It is my opinion that perhaps some remains with double rows of teeth were found, but my perspective on that is that in all likelihood, these people were finding skeletons with several extra teeth, and they may have exaggerated what they found to some degree or another. Unfortunately, I have not seen an actual paper on a skeleton from any of the prehistoric cultures that I am aware of with the large remains, which specifically had a complete row of double teeth. But it is a possibility. I mean, there are people today who have double rows of teeth.
Double.
That would be my sort of question. Would you be talking, Mark, about total sets of teeth or lots of extraneous teeth that are sometimes sitting one behind the other? But you could make sense if a jaw of that size would have extra teeth in it, because, of course, the jaw is so large. So it's interesting.
Well, yes, we have. In the history of anthropology, they have found Cro-Magnon remains with extra teeth, and some that actually were born and genetically developed to have less teeth than modern man. So it isn't uncommon to find in ancient history diverse types of human beings. Mm-hmm. However, what's very interesting about the tall ones in North America is not only were these people around for thousands of years, but they're so recent in the archaeological record. For example, the culture that buried the most large skeletons in their tombs is known as the Adena culture of mound builders in the Ohio Valley. And the conventional dating for Adena is between 500 BC and 200 AD. That's very recent. That's very recent.
Well, in evolutionary speaking, that's like last week, isn't it?
Yes. In fact, The next culture, if we're talking about percentages of large skeletons after Adena, in terms of the most remains of the tall ones in their tombs, is the Mississippian culture, which actually dates to between 900 AD and 1700 AD.
Good Lord.
Yeah,
So
that means Europeans were already starting to come over here at that point.
You see that? Yep.
yes, sir. In our second book, we're going to be publishing archaeological field reports where these giants are found with European trade goods in the later tombs.
Wow.
So let's examine the types of culture. Now, are we looking at one race of the Adena type from the Adena culture of these larger groups of people, or did you find evidence of more than one or multiple groups of giant people in North America?
Okay, I would like to answer that question in two parts, because that's a fantastic question. That's an important question to this field of inquiry. The first book begins in around 4000 BC and records the large skeletons in the tombs of cultures around the Great Lakes in southern Ontario. And this is the Laurentian Old Copper culture. And what happened is around 1500 BC, that culture sort of morphed into another culture known as the Red Ochre Burial Cult. And then the book documents many large remains found by several experts from the Red Ochre cult. And the Red Ochre cult expanded into the Ohio Valley by 1000 BC, where it became the Adena culture. And as we've already said on the show today, the Adena buried more large skeletons in their tombs in the Ohio Valley than any other culture or people anywhere else in the history of the world. So there is a cultural and perhaps a genetic legacy connected with the groups that are in the book. Now, what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of years has a lot to do with the research that we've been doing with linguistics, ethnology, and DNA. And what these three fields have already revealed to us is that not all of these people were directly biologically related. They come from at least 5 major Native American linguistics groups, and they are very, very ancient in their lineages. And this really throws a crowbar in the works for most of the origin theories out there, because what we know at this point is that there is no common genetic frequency or haplogroup which can account for the spread of these people around North America.
Not only that, now, modern archaeologists, much to my annoyance, and maybe it's starting to change a bit, but I just know when I was in school and college, and they always talked about how, oh yes, everybody emigrated out of Africa, humanity spread across the globe, and then all the Native Americans came over the Bering Strait from Asia. In my time in research over the years, I just find that to be total bollocks. But if the and I'd like to hear your opinion on it too, because let's say if these cultures did emigrate over from Asia, then wouldn't there have been evidence of these types of giant people living in Asia? Which it seems most people in Asia tend to biologically be on the shorter end of the height scale.
Well, in the late 1800s, the American antiquarians, who were the first archaeologists, the American antiquarians believed that several of these cultures could have ties to Bronze Age groups from the Near East or Western Europe. Now, we've actually published articles in the past describing these earlier theories. However, what I would like to emphasize is, first of all, the similarities between these cultures are 100% superficial. Their settlement patterns, the way they lived and hunted and fished, the way they grew their plants, and the way they lived and died were totally different. Their material culture was totally different. And perhaps most importantly, with the DNA that we've been studying, there is no genetic evidence of any sort of connection to those groups from Western Europe or the Near East. However, there are large skeletal remains from those tombs in Western Europe, in the barrows of Western Europe, and also in the ancient Near East. In fact, we have 8 chapters ready for a book on the giants in that part of the world. And that'll be coming soon. But whatever their ultimate origins in North America, these people were distinct culturally and genetically. And that's one of the most amazing things to find in this research, is that as we see all these large people from the ancient world, the natural assumption would be, well, perhaps they're all related. But the picture that's emerging in our work suggests that they are not directly related. And probably the answer to this is in the fact that their ties are more ancient than there is any historical record for.
With your research, what has been your primary focus? I know in some of your writings that I have read, you talk a lot about the Adena culture in Ohio. Is that what you've primarily looked into, or have you also looked into the other cultures around the continent?
So I have studied 6 major cultures here in the eastern part of the U.S., and I'm also now engaged in studying the West Coast archaeology. The Adena, really, the first book focuses so much on the Adena for several reasons. First of all, the Adena culture represents a real marker for those of us interested in this field, because there are archaeologists, Smithsonian agents who actually went on record and published the large skeletons from the Adena tombs. So it's really an essential starting point for studying the tall ones, because going back to the precursors of Adena, as I did earlier, it's awfully interesting that when we look at the cultures that are ancestral of Adena, we find more of the same large remains excavated from the tombs. In our second book, we will be talking a good deal more about the Hopewell culture and the Mississippian culture. And as it stands right now, I've already managed to track down twice as many primary accounts from the Mississippian age as I was able to find for the entire first book. So in the end, our goal is to trace the history of these people down to the period of European contact, and ultimately to identify who they are and who their descendants are today.
Has there been any? I know a lot when we talk about the burials, a lot of them were from 100 years ago, and it's really hard to find modern examples of these burials with. Let me put it to you this way. Do we have anywhere in our possession bones or anything that we could collect DNA from to run the genome of these humans?
Yes. There are 3 locations in the United States that have the bones of the Adena giants. And it's something that I usually don't give that information out, because the last thing in the world that we need is a bone rush where every ancient alien's guest is trying to beat down the doors of these places, because it's going to draw a lot of attention. But there are locations where the bones of the tall ones are preserved now, and they could be tested, but many of them have been tested. And we're studying DNA from 4 or 5 different cultures now. And one thing I can tell you immediately is this DNA has no evidence of any type of X factor. In other words, we aren't seeing anything that suggests any type of ET or anything of that nature. Also, the DNA is distinctly Native American. And that's going to be very important going forward. And we're going to publish this research in the sequel to Ages of the Giants.
So
just to be absolutely clear, that you are stating categorically that we are talking, these are humans. They might be taller than average, but we are talking human beings.
They are human beings.
So we're dealing with very tall division of human beings. You wouldn't want to. I don't know what else to call them. They're not another species. They're Homo sapiens sapiens, according to the DNA. Yet there is characteristics in the DNA that allow this culture and these people to be exceptionally tall. Now, I mean, I'm trying to remember. There was the tallest man in the world. Okay, there's tall men, tall women. And I don't believe any of them have ever reached 9 feet, but I could be mistaken. And if they have, the ones that I remember always had some problems. The body proportions weren't normal. They had trouble walking. They needed a cane, or they had hip problems, leg problems, and so it seemed like in those cases, hang on. Sorry, I sneezed. In those cases, it almost seems like a defect of some kind that the body is not able to compensate for the extreme height and causes a lot of different medical problems. But these people that are being found, the body seems to naturally compensate with it from what you're talking about. They seem to have larger jaws, bigger jaws, and in some of the skeletons that they seem to be more directly proportioned for that size. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, it's not an assumption at all, sir. That's exactly what the archaeologists in the 20th century, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, who excavated intact large remains from Adena mounds and also from some of the red ochre sites, they wrote about how the bones were massive and they possessed marked eminences for the attachment of muscles. Even the average population of Adena are usually described as powerfully built, rugged people. And that's very important because that's giving us a viewpoint of the overall gene pool. In fact, you could break the tall ones down into 3 groups. There's a large group of individuals between 6 and 6.5 feet tall. There's another group ranging from 6.5 to 8 feet tall, and then there are very rare individuals approaching 9 feet in height. And anything over that, I typically consider the report to be an exaggeration or pure sensationalism. There are reports of 18-foot tall skeletons and things like that, and I don't believe that there's any evidence of authenticity to that. We know that in the 1800s and early 1900s, people sometimes reported these discoveries as pranks that were later debunked. We actually debunked several skeletons in the pages of our own book when we found the primary sources. There's a report from a mound in West Virginia here that's been reprinted many times over the years of an 8-foot tall skeleton. And we found a measurement of the femur of that skeleton in the archives, and this individual would have been somewhere between 5'11" and 6'3". So we've tried to keep the research honest and report what's actually in the record.
So that's what we're saying. The bodies you're talking about are normally proportioned but extremely large, whereas people like Robert Wadlow at say 8'11", he looked very elongated, and the very, very tall people tend to look like they had been stretched, whereas these guys are in correct proportion in their body mass, their body form. Would that be right?
That's absolutely right.
Oh, good. I did a bit of good reading then.
I'm actually I pulled up a list here of the tallest human beings ever recorded, according with Wikipedia, and Guinness Book of World Record had Robert Wadlow listed as 8 foot 11.1 inches, so damn near 9 foot tall. But I remember pictures of Robert Wadlow, and again, the legs seemed abnormal. He had trouble walking. He needed a cane. And there's a couple of the next couple of tallest people below him suffered from different ailments. And so again, it seems like in our current the current oh God, I don't even know what to call them. The current class of people, and class is not right because that makes it sound like financial or racial, and that's not it. It's just these types of people who get really tall now seem to have the problems, and now we have this culture of people who are perfectly normal being between 7 to 9 feet tall. And they had the bulk, and they were rugged people. Now, let me ask a question: where did they go?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that you guys have made several comments about the physicality of Adena. The anthropologists and archaeologists, including William S. Webb, Charles Snow, and Don Dragoo, wrote extensively about this anthropology in their own books, and I'd highly encourage people to read those books, especially a book called Mounds for the Dead by Don Dragoo, because they outline in these works this unique physicality that we're talking about right now. And also, for our book, we actually worked with an artist, Marcia K. Moore, to create the living image of what these Adena people actually looked like. And Marcia used photographs of skeletons and skulls, as well as skeletal measurements and bone measurements for those recreations, and they certainly didn't have any problems getting around, let's just say that. And I'd highly recommend people, they can see some of the recreations in our book, or they can visit her website, marciakmoore.com, to see the image of what these people may have looked like. As far as explaining or typing what it is we're dealing with, I like to refer to them as a type of humankind that is no longer common. And for some reason, they persisted in North America longer than anywhere else in the world. The reasons for that could have something to do with the types of cultural upheavals that Europeans experienced that North Americans did not in ancient history. Mm-hmm. For example, in Europe, during the Neolithic period, we had the Neolithic Revolution, where the lifestyle and the diet of the population was completely transformed. And anthropologists used to think the Neolithic Revolution was this wonderful thing because everyone had something to eat. This was the dawn of Big Agra. But now we know that it had catastrophic effects on certain populations. Their health decreased, their bones became weaker. Whereas here in North America, people lived a basic hunter-gatherer lifestyle for millennia longer than in other parts of the world.
That is interesting. Yeah, it's a very good thought. That's the different way in which humans developed more recently as well. As you say, that the farming, the change to that kind of culture and agriculture, as opposed to the hunter-gatherer, which would continue to have to be physically fit and strong and able to survive the, sort of moving across the landscape, would make a real difference. Yeah, and that definitely makes sense. In fact, the idea that to be hunter-gatherer in North America, the great open plains, that kind of thing, you'd have to have that physicality, that sort of physical strength and size to be able to travel greater distances and probably move faster as well.
That's correct, sir. And if you look at the exchange networks that the Adena and Hopewell cultures here in North America, if you look at their exchange networks, it reached all the way from the Gulf Coast to southern Canada and perhaps all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So these people were highly mobile. They had far-reaching ties which persisted for thousands of years. Their religion persisted in one form or another for 5,000 to 6,000 years that we can document in the archaeological record. We know that the old Copper people in the Great Lakes region, who buried some of the oldest giants in their tombs, we know that they were fabricating sophisticated hunting and fishing artifacts, more sophisticated than anything else in the world, for 3,000 years by 6,000 BC. So the development of humankind in North America is dramatically different than anywhere else in the world. And I believe that the answer to this mystery can be found in that.
Of course, as a continent, it was quite isolated for a very large landmass. It was quite isolated from the rest of the world. So the idea there would be a very different development culturally and socially of mankind, it makes perfect sense, certainly.
Well, if you look at the dynamics over the last couple thousand years, you have Europe, Africa, and Asia, and in India, and with a couple up to 5,000 years ago, Western civilization started to form with the Greeks, the Romans. I mean, even before that, you had the Egyptians, the Sumerians, doing these very advanced cultures in terms of building, creating societies, cities, trade, traveling to other parts of the world and expanding. And then, by the time the Romans came around, and I always have to say bloody Romans, the Romans came around, they conquered most of the known world and spread out all through Europe and brought that type of civilization to Europe. And then even when Rome fell and Christianity rose, Islam rose, there was most of that part of the world, the eastern part of the world, was still far more advanced than North America. And in fact, take a look at North America compared to South America. South America, going all the way up from South America into Mexico, had very advanced cultures up until a couple of hundred years ago, with the Toltecs, the Aztec, the Maya, and building their big cities and civilizations. Yet in North America, we don't really have a lot of evidence of it. It was more of the, as Jason mentioned, the hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder why that might have been. I mean, you could think about maybe because of the Ice Age came in and North America was covered in glaciers for the longest time. But even then, those melted 10,000 years ago. And, in Europe had them too. So what's the difference between Europe in that part of the world and America? The only other continent that I could point to that was similar to North America would be Australia.
Yes, I was just thinking the same. Yeah, right. That's the similar kind of culture there.
Right, the Aborigines there who remained that hunter-gatherer types of societies, just like North America did.
Well, if I could interject something.
Please,
I don't know if you can do that, Jason. You only have a guess. You can't say anything. Go ahead.
So we're talking about civilization, and this is one of my favorite topics, is what is civilization? because in archaeology, there are three primary traits that archaeologists search for in seeking to define a civilization. One of these traits is advanced metallurgy. Another is a common system of communication, be it symbolic or writing. And the third is population packing, usually due to a common food source such as agriculture. If we look at North America, between 5,000 and 4,000 BC, the population was already using a common form of symbolic expression. In fact, they were fashioning these elaborate bone pins with symbols and clan glyphs on them, and they were using them to pin their clothing together. They were wearing tunics and other types of clothes. They had a common form of ritual expression because there were already burial mounds being built in the Deep South, and there were mounds and shell mounds in the Ohio River and Illinois and other places. And, as I mentioned before, American metallurgy was at an extremely advanced level by 6,000 BC. And I would also like to add that although archaeologists will only admit that Native Americans were fabricating copper implements with cold hammering, the fact is that copper artifacts that were made from being melted and casted have been found in Wisconsin and Michigan. The issue is there are so few of them, and I believe that it's possible that to the ancient North Americans, melting copper to give it a completely distinct shape may merely have been something that they considered to be a violation of natural principles, and so they may have chosen to discard it. Oh. So ultimately, the one thing missing from North America to define an ancient civilization is population cluster. There's no footprint in the earth where we see large cities as we see in ancient Sumeria or ancient Egypt. But I have to ask the question of whether or not our concept of leaving a large parking lot in the middle of nature is actually an advancement or not. I think that it's probably up for debate. It could be that our ramifications for defining civilization need to be reviewed.
I think that if you look at, and for me, I think of civilization as being people coming together, building actual buildings and structures that are more permanent in terms of either brick and mortar rather than wood or straw, or like the migrating cultures like the Plains Indians, Native Americans moving back and forth from different camps following the games, a little more mobile. You could have a city in the Middle East, with Sumerian civilization, or was it Is it in Iraq? Yeah. Or even cities in Egypt. We don't have the ancient cities in the North America that, and again, I'm going to say that I'm aware of. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm fascinated in the subject, and I know there are certain communities like Mesa Verde where they built that whole town under that cliff a long time ago, but there are not very many of them. So I guess that's, in a way, I would classify more in terms of cities, civilization.
Well, an interesting thing about this subject is a lot of people seem to be under the impression that the tall ones in North America were an elite class, or that they were ruling the rest of the population. But what fascinates me is I have seen archaeological reports of excavations where, in some instances, they are incredibly prestigious burials. There was a skeleton around 7 feet tall that was found in the Crescent Mound in West Virginia with numerous prestigious and exotic artifacts. But at the same time, we see a good number of them that weren't buried with anything at all. which means that, to me at least, that although they were a persistent part of the population, they did not necessarily exercise any type of power in all cases.
So their own society, there are different levels. They have their own leaders and rulers, and then the followers, the standing members. So they did, if you forgive the pun, as it were, they had their own kind of levels of society, such as it was. So you're not basically not all, because they were giants, they weren't all seen as some kind of super being. They were just had their own kind of structure. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Cool.
No, I know. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, just a question coming back to the individuals. I was wondering, did you have any sense of their lifespan? Were they of a similar lifespan to those around them? Were they to live longer or shorter lives? Is there any way of knowing that?
There is. When we're dealing with, I'll just talk about the Adena in this instance because a lot of research has been done on their settlement patterns. The typical Adena community would have consisted of several hamlets or families, hunter-gatherers, that buried their dead in a burial mound on a regular basis. And we can learn a lot by studying the bones and diet of individual groups of excavated skeletons. And the way that it appears is it was different for each group. One group may be more prone to diseases based on their diet than another group, but their lifespans are nothing outside of what we would expect for normal human beings. There are some cases where we see mounds with high infant mortality rates, or even archaic burials with high rates of child deaths, but these are usually due to lifestyle or the location where these communities were located, because the environment could be harsher in some places than others. So again, it brings us back to the reality that these individuals possessed a unique physicality, but they still lived and died as human beings.
So essentially the same as us.
Yes, the same as us. There's very little evidence of violence among them.
Well, that's interesting.
In fact, violence really did not become that widespread among their societies until the fall of the Hopewell culture in around 450 AD, which in our book I talk about that. There was a common cosmology that bound these cultures together and enabled them to persist for so many millennia. And sometime between 400 and 500 AD, there was a paradigm collapse in that cosmology. And following that paradigm collapse, we see the emergence of large clusters of settlements surrounded by wooden palisades. We see an increase in violence. And eventually we see the rise of the Mississippian culture from out of that. And the Mississippian culture, this is the first time in American prehistory that we see deified elites lording over the population, lording over an underclass. But until that time period, there isn't much evidence of mass warfare.
What do you think brought about the change? I mean, you talked about it briefly, but could you go into more detail?
Well, certainly. There is an ancient cult that existed for thousands of years in North America. And some archaeologists refer to it as the cult of the dead or the cult of red ochre. And the cosmology of this burial cult divided reality or the universe into three realms. There was an earth realm, an under realm or an underworld, and a sky realm or the heavens. And the reason for the construction of an artificial burial mound or mountain was that the ancients believed that a central pillar or axis mundi united the three realms. And by burying their dead together in a mound, different communities believed that they were adopting a common ancestry because they believed their ancestors were joined together in the realms beyond this one. And sometime around 450 AD, and we have a lot of evidence coming from this from the Scioto Valley in Ohio, sometime around 450 AD, 1/3 of the communities participating in this cult of the dead, which was by that time centered in Ohio, withdrew. And when they withdrew, it triggered a paradigm collapse because supposedly everyone's had adopted a common ancestry and it had divine sanction. And from out of that collapse, we eventually see the emergence of individual bands and tribes warring with each other, and we see the emergence of the chiefs and the power brokers of the later Mississippian period.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, there are stories amongst other Native American tribes that talk about these tribes or other races of giants. And there are stories that they were a very warlike, cannibalistic peoples. Mm-hmm. That many of these tribes claim to have gone to war with and killed off. What is your take on that compared to what you were saying about that there did not seem to be much in the way of warfare or violence in their cultures?
Well, my job as a researcher is to report what I find, and in some cases to compare and contrast that with what people may say or what the legends and mythologies may say. I know that the Lovelock Cave story is a very intriguing instance of what you're talking about.
Yes.
In the book, we actually found several primary sources that do document a skeleton or a mummy reaching 7 feet in height from that cave. It was stolen by a fraternal lodge and used in initiation ceremonies. So we know that there were some exceptionally tall people among the Lovelock Cave population, that's for certain. Probably the most famous instance of a Native American oral history or tradition which records a war with the giants is the one that was communicated by the Delaware Indians to the missionaries about a group of people that they refer to as Telegui. And there are many different variations of that name that have been used down through the years. One form of the name is Allegheny, which is presumably what the Allegheny Mountains and the Allegheny River were named after. And in this instance, we're doing some research now using linguistics, and we believe that we've actually found the actual tribe that the Delaware were describing. And that's research that we'll be publishing in the near future. But in terms of the cultures that we've written about in the book, I have found zero evidence of cannibalism as a cultural practice. There are instances when we see Adena mounds containing artifacts that were made from human bones. For instance, at the Fisher Mound in Kentucky, several bowls, which may have been used in rituals, had been made from human skulls. We know that they curated the remains of their dead sometimes for generations before burial. There have been skulls found that are actually several decades older than any of the other burials in a mound, but they've been placed with a more recent burial. And the general thinking on that is that these are ancestors of some of the dead in the mounds. But cannibalism as a ritual practice seems to be something that probably began to occur sometime after 1000 AD. which again would bring us to the age of the Mississippian culture.
So, and were there any causes that you're aware of that would cause a culture to suddenly become cannibalistic like that?
Well, not all of the people that participated in some of the more recent traditions engaged in this practice. It's more of the effect of warfare between specific tribes. I know that some of the early colonists recorded some of the tribes off the Atlantic coast engaged in these practices. And since it seems to have been something that was being done to their enemies in warfare or people they were at odds with, it could have been a practice that was associated with the antagonisms that they were engaged in.
Well, one of the things I find particularly fascinating is this idea that it's kind of in the background. It's not really researched properly, almost a bit of a mystery, as it's not almost seen as sort of beyond the fringe, which is ridiculous. There's clearly a lot of evidence of this kind of these guys exist in the groups you're talking about. Why do you think that is, Jason? Why is it treated in the way it is?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. First of all, this is definitely an anthropological mystery. And one of the things that's occurred over the last several decades is a lot of subjects have been heaped on top of it, which actually don't belong there. I heard someone say recently in a podcast that the burial mounds and earthworks that these people were buried in were protected by some type of supernatural magic. Well, these mounds and earthworks have been destroyed by bulldozers, dynamite, and the pick and spade for over 100 years. So if there's magic protecting them, it's doing a crummy job. That has created, though, a taboo around this subject for the professional anthropologist, because the professional anthropologist has too much to lose to talk about these discoveries if it's going to be used as, you know, this anthropologist confirms aliens or the Nephilim. And these are all subjects that have been attached to a very real mystery that we have real tangible evidence of. Another reason is we have a postscript in our book about what really happened to these remains. And what occurred was in the early 1900s, archaeology in America and in Europe fell under the sway of the international eugenics movement. And what a lot of people don't realize about the international eugenics movement is that the elites that participated in eugenics had a very real philosophy or religion that they believed in. It was a religion of their own ancestors. If you go and read the published works of people like Madison Grant, you'll find that the eugenicists at the turn of the last century considered themselves to be descended from an ancient population of gigantic people. And so when races that they considered to be inferior to themselves, as they did the Native Americans, when those people's ancestors were reaching heights the type that we're talking about today, they found this to be a problem in their racial hierarchy. And it just so happens that at the same moment that the Smithsonian initiated its policy of denial regarding these skeletal remains was also the point in time when an archaeogenicist named Elis Hrdlicka took over the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum. So what we're dealing with is likely a perfect storm of factors where you have these scientific racialists who had a vested interest in denying the existence of these remains in the early 1900s, And then today we have archaeologists and anthropologists who are coming out of the same universities that those people set up.
Mm.
You know, the eugenics movement in the 20th century, especially in the earlier part of the 20th century, was becoming a worldwide phenomenon, and I hate to say it, a really disturbing one. The Nazis, of course, were very much into eugenics and trying to promote their fantastical Aryan race theory, which was a load of crap. But, you know, as their excuse for, you know, the Holocaust and going after the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, everybody else. But, you know, the eugenics movement had a lot of traction here in the U.S., too. And there were a lot of different programs put into place. I mean, I firmly believe the Tuskegee I can't pronounce it. The Tuskegee experiments where they were infecting black men with syphilis, you know, was all part of that in terms of trying to enhance human beings to have the quote unquote perfect or master race. You know, which basically most of us alive today wouldn't make the cut.
Well,
it's a terrible truth how much politics influences everything else. It becomes a tool of political game playing and agendas, even things like anthropology as well. These kind of things are all sucked into that kind of horrible space of, if it's politically expedient to think this way, we will do, regardless of reality, regardless of facts. It is a horrible situation.
The American Eugenics Society actually targeted over 14 million Americans for elimination. And as justification for what they did, they employed anthropologists in the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Smithsonian to formulate a type of racial hierarchy or genetic caste system. And their goal was to categorize humankind into this catalog. And in the United States, this was a period of absolute barbarism. There were 60,000 people in 27 U.S. states that were sterilized under eugenics laws in America. Doctors were encouraged to engage in lethal neglect, allowing patients to die if they had inferior genetic characteristics. In fact, at the Institute for the Feeble-Minded in Lincoln, Illinois, patients were given milk from a herd of cattle infected with tuberculosis, which increased mortality rates by 40%.
Good Lord.
By 1911, the Carnegie Institute, the American Breeders Association, and the United States Department of Agriculture were actually working together on plans to implement lethal gas chambers to kill individuals that they deemed unworthy of life. So really what happened in Nazi Germany was an export from the United States.
A pretty dreadful thought.
And you know what? This is what gets me when people who don't understand their own history, you know, and, you know, keeping politics aside, you know, the people who do scream, let's say, oh, America is so great, okay, are the ones who don't want to admit all the flaws and the things that we've done in the past. And this country has done some horrible freaking things, from genocide to Native Americans in the 1800s to the eugenics experiments in the 1900s. And even now, I personally believe, which, you know, I'll put my tinfoil hat on, that we've been seeing the direct results of societal conditioning for the past 40 years, trying to push us in certain directions and change generations of thought of how people think. So it's all very insidious, and yet it comes straight out of America. I mean, let's face it. We've had shows that we've talked about with MK Ultra, and the MK Ultra programs, which is an historic fact. They happened. And the evidence that with Project Paperclip, when after World War II, when we imported a lot of the Nazi scientists over here under Project Paperclip, they didn't just go all work for NASA on rockets. They went into other programs, including MK Ultra, and I think some of these eugenics programs.
Well, there's more and more evidence to suggest that a lot of the actual SS hierarchy officers changed their occupation at the last minute to scientists, quotation marks, to escape through the paperclip program. For every sort of 5 genuine scientists, but scientists who came through, one of them wasn't at all. So there's more evidence to suggest that quite a few of the Nazi hierarchy also escaped to America under that same program. But you're quite right. It's a little disturbing, I think, is probably the best word we can use right now for this.
If you look at it from a standpoint of we modern day, we think it's absolutely the most horrendous idea of what happened in the past with the Holocaust and the killing of people, and thinking that human beings are not equal and not created equal. And yet it wasn't that long ago that was a very predominant idea in Western culture. And notice I say Western culture, because when you start looking at the Aboriginal cultures around the world, from the Native Americans to the Aborigines in Australia, and even some of the more primitive peoples in like Brazil and South America that were cut off from the mainstream, okay, you didn't have this import of our society is better than your society, you're inferior, we're going to wipe you out. You know, look at when the Spanish first came over here to the New World, and what they did with both North and South America, especially South America. They just massacred everybody and then forced everyone to their religion, to Christianity, and they were made slaves of the people because they were thought inferior. You know, it really wasn't all that long ago. And,
absolutely.
I mean, I'm sorry, got a little delay there. I was saying, God, even under the Romans, even the Romans didn't practice that. They just wanted everybody to serve them and send money their way, but they didn't practice mainstream genocide. You know,
they were quite a utilitarian society in Rome. It was make use of everybody. If they had a particular skill set, you might be a slave, no rights or freedom, but they would use you rather than just destroy you. I mean, okay, we know the stories about the Romans and the Christians in the arenas and being ripped apart. I mean, a lot of those stories are actually, there were criminals who were treated that way, not necessarily wholesale Christians for being Christians. But going back to one of the other things that Jason and I briefly spoke about as well, is this whole notion of a popular theme in a lot of Native American cultures is the idea of sky beings and things of that nature, not necessarily aliens, but gods, if you like, coming from the sky. And I was wondering, Jason, is there that kind of stories in these groups as well, the giants?
Well, with the Adena and Hopewell, I mentioned their cosmology earlier of an earth plane, an above world, and an underworld. And the symbolism on many of their more exotic copper artifacts, and also a series of stone and clay tablets that have been found in Adena mounds, we see a lot of reference to the flight of the dead along the axis mundi into the above realm. And some of these may be representations of shaman who were visiting the above realm in shamanistic trances. There's also a lot of symbolism spanning a few thousand years with the mound building cultures of the great birds, the celestial birds, as intermediaries between the earth plane and the above realm. But it's important to point out that these traditions of the mound builders actually survived among Native Americans with us today, and we can look to them for clarification on what they mean. And the symbolism is intended here to represent the journey of the dead after death. And there are many different permutations of this viewpoint. But in summary, these ancients believed they lived in an inhabited cosmos. They believed that there were creatures that lived in the underworld and the above realm and in the earth realm that we would consider mythic. To them, there were giant thunderbirds or dragons, and there were sea serpents and large serpents with horns and copper scales that lived in the rivers and lakes.
Interesting. It's I always find it fascinating, the idea of the thunderbird, the giant bird, and then in Europe you have the dragon. I've often wondered if they are interpreting some lost creature, both seeing a similar kind of creature but no longer existent to us. But it's fascinating stuff. So it's more about those kind of mythic tales, if you like, of what happens after death, and that's now been reinterpreted by us in modern times as being more extraterrestrial, but it's just the way we see these ideas as opposed to how they would have seen them.
That's very well put. And it's important to remember that to the mound builders, death was merely a transformation into a different state and a passage to another world. So that is why it was so important to them, perhaps, that in order to hold their societies together and to encourage all manner of ties and alliances, that different groups buried their dead together in a particular ossuary or a conical or square-shaped burial mound, because this represented a joining together of different peoples and them adopting a common heritage. So these different realms that are sort of referenced in the artifacts and in the record, these realms are, to them, were very real places where the spirit could go after death, or where the mind or spirit of the ritual specialist could visit in trance states.
I often find it interesting that different cultures, primitive cultures around the world, historically, the building of mounds is a common theme for burial in terms of, you get a lot of tumuli over here in the UK, they're the similar kind of thing, often a smaller scale, but rather than the idea of digging a hole just into the ground as you'd like a Christian burial and put them in and then the smooth over the top, you're finding mounds being built in different cultures around the world who wouldn't have been connected to each other in any way, shape or form. So I often find that is fascinating as well, that there is that underlying deeper kind of understanding of reaching to the sky, not in a UFO sky sense, but that kind of higher realm stuff. I wonder if that's something that continues.
It's probable that the barrows in the UK, which the conical mounds of the UK, they come along at the Copper Age, probably around sometime between 3000 and 2800 BC is really when widespread rounded conical mounds began to be built in the UK, even though there were some earlier. And it's also true that many of the mounds in the UK and the mounds that we're describing from North America today are very similar. For instance, there's a type of mound in the UK called a bell barrow. That's a conical mound surrounded by an earth hinge with a single causewayed entryway.
Yes.
The Adena built those mounds also.
That's fascinating.
There's one intact at Marietta, Ohio today that's around 30 feet high, and it's still surrounded by a large earthen hinge with a single causeway passage to the mound. And I've seen interpretations of both the Adena and the bell barrows of the Wessex culture in England as the same symbol. And this supposedly could represent the axis mundi, or world pillar, in cross section. So in other words, you imagine a great tree connecting different worlds and you're looking at it in cross section. Both cultures also may have considered water to be a barrier between the living and the dead, which the water may have actually filled the ditches in those earth hinges also.
It is interesting, isn't it, how different cultures who have no real connection to each other can develop the same kind of ideas, the same linkage. I mean, I'm sort of throwing my hat in the ring as well. I am very much a Jungian psychotherapist. So I'm interested in the collective unconscious and archetypal imagery and the connections there. And to me, again, this is almost like a physical, real-world example of convergent thinking, that they're kind of almost backwards convergent because it's ancient, but they're having the same kind of ideas in groups and cultures that are completely disconnected from each other, yet they're showing some kind of deep level of similarity to produce the same kind of ideas.
Well, I have a background in depth psychology also, and I believe that things like this are definitely a manifestation of the collective unconscious. But there's also the possibility that the people who built these structures are connected on a deeper ancestral basis than anyone has allowed for. In other words, if we go back in time far enough, there may be connections that have not been associated yet.
That's interesting, yeah. I mean, I had a read of your website and I saw the depth psychology mentioned that, so I knew you knew what I was talking about on those lines. But yeah, do you want to expand a bit more upon that? Because that's quite interesting.
Well, if we're going to talk about the mounds in England, we should talk about their ultimate point of origin. Mm-hmm. The barrow builders, the round barrow builders of England, the genetic tests that have been done over the last few years have proven conclusively that they migrated out of the steppe and quite possibly from Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
In around 3100 BC, and that is the true origin of what we call Indo-Europeans, because we know that they completely supplanted the earlier Neolithic people.
Yes.
Now, if you look at the anthropology papers from the steppes and Mesopotamia going back to around 4500 BC, they were finding skeletons that have been called massive and Cro-Magnid. So it's possible that there is an ancestral tie between the peoples that we're discussing. It just happens to be one that is far more ancient than any of the diffusionist theories that people have suggested have covered.
That was going to bring me on to a question I wanted to put to you as well. Have you had much opportunity to research these giants in other parts of the world? Is there evidence for their existence elsewhere other than North America?
Yes, I have. We have actually worked on a book about the giants in Europe and the Middle East, and it has a lot of the information we're talking about right now planned for it. And there is strong evidence of people with a similar anthropology in the Copper Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age barrows in Western and Central Europe. So we're talking about the corded ware culture, the Wessex culture, and the various cultures of the Iron Age that are usually subsumed under the Celtic label. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, if you look at the chronicles of the Roman generals, they recorded wars with Celtic giants when they were waging their battle of extermination against the Indo-Europeans. So there's actually strong evidence for the tall ones, or a people who had the tall ones among them in that part of the world.
That's interesting. Again, it's a question of why this isn't more widely researched, and I think we've really kind of answered that question earlier on, but it does seem as if it's an area that's been almost completely almost completely ignored, that they haven't really been explored properly. I think my question would be, what's happened to them? Where are they now? How do they sort of disappear?
Well, there are as many theories about that as there are writers, so I have no claim. I have no claim to all the answers. All I can do is offer you what my own insights are. And first of all, I'd like to point out that here in North America, the tall ones did not disappear altogether. But with the introduction of Europeans, 70%, and that's a conservative number, 70% of Native American lineages went extinct.
Mm-hmm.
So the Native Americans living among us today only represent a fraction of the people who were here in the prehistoric period. That being said, there are Native American tribes and linguistic groups who still have the tall ones born among them today. You'll find that some descendants of modern Iroquois, Algonquian, and Siouan speakers are people who have an anthropology that is sometimes very like these prehistoric individuals we're studying. Now, in terms of other parts of the world, we notice that these types of people seem to have disappeared much more quickly than in North America, and there has never been found anywhere on Earth as many gigantic skeletons have been found in the Mississippi Valley here in America. And it's my belief that it has something to do with the history of the people. And we touched on this earlier. You know, in Europe, we had the Neolithic Revolution, and then the Bronze Age brought in the first elites.
Mm-hmm.
And this is completely different than the way of life that people in North America were living for thousands of years. So there could be several factors that have a lot to do with how we live in Western society today and how Westerners have lived for more than 1,000 years, which contribute to the disappearance of this unique type of human being. It could be a form of genetic expression, which is no longer common. And it could be a type of person that requires certain environmental conditions in order to exist.
The other thing that, and Andy, you had mentioned on part of this earlier, and this is the whole theme of our talk tonight, is the fact that why don't we as a society know more or hear more about these people, these tall people? It seems to me, now this is the other thing we have not discussed yet, but is a conspiracy kind of related event, is the fact of the Smithsonian Institution and how much they have come into play in anything regarding something unusual historically here in the U.S. There seems to be a lot of fingers pointed at the Smithsonian for covering this information up. In your research, what have you found?
The Smithsonian in the late 1800s acknowledged these discoveries. In fact, if you were to pull up, you can find it on archive.org, or you can read about it in the book. There are two Smithsonian reports from the 1800s, the 5th and 12th annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology. Both of those reports mention multiple skeletons that fall between 7 and 8 feet in length. There are also countless other papers that we noted in the book by people that were working for the Smithsonian that also acknowledged the large skeletons. The Smithsonian really didn't initiate a policy of denial until Elie Serdelicka became the head of the Department of Anthropology. And
when was that?
Well, Serdelicka became, he had been affiliated with the Smithsonian for a number of years because all of these anthropologists were familiar with one another for a considerable amount of time. But in 1910, he actually became a curator. So it's at this time that we really start to see people begin to disparage the public when people would ask about the large remains in the older reports. Serdelicka could barely give a public interview without sort of browbeating people who believed that the tall ones had existed. And what's interesting about Serdelicka is we found several reports of large skeletal remains that mentioned that the bones were sent to Hrdlička for study. So we know that his office not only had access to hundreds of skeletons that were excavated by the Bureau of Ethnology, but also continued to receive remains from around the country, some of which were very large. So it would appear that under Hrdlička's direction, the Smithsonian initiated the policy of denial. And there are a lot of stories about the Smithsonian destroying the bones and things like that, but since I can't find any direct evidence of that, it's not something I'm prepared to say. But basically, following the 1920s, we see the tall ones gradually become a subject of academic taboo, if you will. Although there were numerous archaeologists, including some of the most important archaeologists of the 20th century, who still honestly reported the discoveries, including William S. Webb, Don Dragoo, Martin and Randalls. There are, in fact, accounts going all the way up to the 1980s. In terms of what's happening today, I'm not prepared to say that what's going on today is a continuation of what, in my opinion, is a much older conspiracy. What's happening today is we have a group of very loud archaeologists and super skeptics and online personalities who have sort of made a profession out of attacking anything outside the mainstream of archaeological theory. And because so few people actually do their homework on these accounts of the tall ones, it's actually easy prey for those people to sort of play whack-a-mole with it. But in the end, this is really the legacy, I believe, of forces that were at work in archaeology and anthropology 100 years ago.
So Hrdlička's real reason for wanting to get rid of the idea of these giants was the eugenics, as we were talking about before. Then it was part of that agenda.
Well, there were several possible motives, and we suggested a couple of what a couple of them could be in the postscript of the book. One possible motive, and there were probably multiple motives at work at the same time. One motive would have been the sort of scientific racialism they wanted to use against Native Americans, as you stated. Another possibility, and this is very important, another possibility comes from the literature of the founders of eugenics. Eugenics was actually founded in the 1800s by a French aristocrat named Arthur de Gobineau. And de Gobineau founded eugenics as what he referred to as Aryanism. And it was this idea that there had been a prehistoric super race that colonized all around the globe. And one of his adherents was a French professor named Vacher de la Pauge. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because Vacher de la Pauge was the number one influence on several streams of eugenics thought, including that of the Third Reich. And Lapauge, in 1889 and 1890, excavated a burial mound in Mediterranean France and went on record discovering a gigantic skeleton that, according to Lapauge, measured over 11 feet tall. And this is known popularly as the Giant of Castelnau. This skeleton was actually peer-reviewed several times during the time period and never really debunked. But what's important is that Lapauge was an associate of Elis Hrdlička. That means that the same eugenicist who in the United States initiated the policy of denial through the Smithsonian was friends with a eugenicist in France who had gone on record with finding a prehistoric giant. And from that point on, you can find references in all the eugenics literature to their own ancestors being these exceptionally tall people. So some of the eugenicists may have considered these bones to be their personal property.
So they keep them under wraps. There also just seems to be a concentrated effort, especially in the 20th century moving forward. There are a lot of strange things here in the United States. I mean, we have pyramids here. We've had proof that not only did the Vikings come here almost 1,000 years before Columbus, or at least several hundred years before Columbus, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting many different cultures from Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere may have made it to North America. And most of this information, again, is downplayed. It's poo-pooed. It's people won't take it seriously. And it goes against this current grain in archaeology that states that, nope, we already know what the history is. Don't try to change it. You know, especially if it's something fantastic like, hey, possibly maybe the Egyptians made it as far as North America, because there's evidence that they may have made it as far into Arizona, you know, or into the Grand Canyon. There's the famous case of the cave supposedly found in the early 20th century in the Grand Canyon. Then once again, the Smithsonian Institution came in and had it sealed off, and that section of the Grand Canyon is posted against people going in that, looking for things. So they don't want us to know for whatever reason. They want to keep things as simple as possible. And yet, there's so many wonderful things here. I mean, even the mound culture itself. We're not taught about the mound culture in school, you know? And hey, I went to school 40 freaking years ago when they still taught some things, but not like now where it's where the kids don't learn a damn thing in American history or any other history for that matter anymore. But still, you know, the mounds is something that is very intriguing, and yet they don't. It's a footnote. People aren't aware of them. The Serpent Mound in Ohio. It's in Ohio, right?
That's right.
Yes. Is an incredible feat of engineering. And yet again, unless you watch the History Channel or see an Ancient Aliens episode, it's barely ever even mentioned.
Well, you know, I can offer you some of my own experience with archaeologists, because I've actually come to consider myself a real student of archaeology. I love archaeology, and it just naturally follows that I brush shoulders with archaeologists from time to time. And in 2016, I did a presentation in Ohio on the tall ones, and I presented much of the same information we talked about tonight. And there was an archaeologist sitting in the front row who challenged me and stated in front of a room full of 70 people that he would check my references. And if the archaeologists I mentioned had actually found large skeletons, he would go public with that information and publish it in an archaeological journal. So this was very exciting for a number of reasons. So when I heard back from the archaeologist, he had checked all my references and found that they checked out. There was no reason to doubt the measurements of the skeletons, but he had decided the information was simply not important enough to publish. Now, that is probably the key to our problem. Who decides what aspects of history are important?
Mm-hmm.
Who is allowed to decide for us what we are to be taught? And when you consider how much archaeology is funded by tax dollars, why should we have to pay for that information to begin with?
Absolutely. I was just going to throw my hat in again briefly. I used to be a school teacher for a period of time, and one of the reasons why I left was exactly that. We were being told to teach X, Y, Z without any real explanation as to why. And large areas of particular history, one of my real areas of interest, was being left out. We were being asked to teach about the building of Stonehenge, which is important, significant, the ancient Stonehenge site here, but we didn't teach about World War II. And to me, that seemed a rather strange order of events to be teaching. To teach about the building of Stonehenge, yes, has its significance and importance, but then not teach World War II. So I agree entirely with what you're saying there. It's who decides these things? Who decides what history is important, which piece of history isn't important, and which one we should ignore, and which one we should tell everyone about? And to him to say that, oh, yes, you're absolutely right, but it's not important enough, it's ridiculous. It's clearly, it's an agenda again, as Mark was saying before. It's agendas, political agendas about deciding what is to be taught and what isn't to be taught. It's nothing to do with knowledge, it's to do with what's politically expedient. No, that's ridiculous.
It's also the fact that there are so many scientists out there, whether they're archaeologists or other scientists, who find evidence of something that is controversial, and they won't publish it. They won't. They'll stick with towing the line because they will lose their careers.
That's it, exactly. It's about funding, isn't it? It's about producing stuff that might curtail your funding. Therefore, you're not going to do that because you want to keep the money coming in to keep doing what you're doing, which means you have to abandon certain ideas and beliefs and evidence of things because it doesn't fit with what is expected to gain the funding.
It's the tyranny of the peer review process. If you publish something in an academic journal and your peers destroy you for it or criticize you for it, you run the risk of not getting funding. And it's that precious funding that matters. For example, in 2016, an archaeologist was paid $39,000 to do a survey of one mound site in Ohio. That's the type of money we're talking about. No one's going to risk a career like that to publish a controversial discovery. So it falls to the educated amateur to try to fill the void. And the real question with this mystery and any number of other mysteries like the ones that Mark mentioned, the real question is, does academia have a right to decide what you know about and what should be important to you?
Mm-hmm. What is the criteria they apply?
And the question is, why is it so important to suppress this information? Are they afraid of the public reaction? Are they afraid that people might actually, start to wake up and realize that our history is a lot more strange and interesting than we're being told? That there are things that might contradict religious beliefs, political beliefs? I mean,
that's the point. That's exactly the reasons why, Mark. That is it. You don't want to upset that status quo that you worked so hard to create. And anything that really does throw a spanner in those works, no, keep that in the background. And also I think it becomes almost second nature to lie to keep that status quo as is. So it becomes just second nature to deny these things because it affects that status quo. So I think you're right there. You're saying it yourself. It is because it upsets things like religion and politics that they don't want that to happen.
Well, it also has a lot to do with some of the archaeological practices that have been engaged in. I met a retired archaeologist from Ohio who actually was an assistant to digging one of the mounds where one of these large skeletons were found in the 1960s. And he came forward and explained to me that when they found the large skeleton, the chief archaeologist on the site, who worked for a major historical society in Ohio, actually dumped the bones in the garbage, along with the rest of the remains from the mounds. So a lot of people may believe that the bones of the tall ones are sitting in some airlocked chamber somewhere, but the majority of them were thrown in the trash along with the rest of the bones of the ancestral Native Americans.
Oh, ridiculous.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And that was also old time archaeology. I mean, archaeology really started to become a real science in the 1800s. But back then, there wasn't much of a distinction between an archaeologist and a tomb raider. Because they would ransack these tombs, no respect for the dead or the burial practice of the person there. It was, what can we find and how can we sell it? And the idea that they go into these tombs of these giant people, a monumental discovery, not to mention just the bones, but all of the other artwork and the history, the ornaments, the jewelry, whatever that could tell us about that culture. It just gets ransacked and you throw the bones away because you don't need them. You got your goodies and you can go sell them now to a museum or something. I mean, nowadays we have a lot better procedures for digging on archaeological sites and taking great care to preserve and catalog. But yet there's still that predominant idea that, if you find something and it's too controversial, we're going to have to bury it. You don't want
There's another aspect to this that I'd like to add while we're talking about it. Academia today is largely a byproduct of the university. These people, the experts, they all come from the university circuit. And the university today in America exists to deprive humanity of any belief in anything higher than the state. And these artifacts and relics that we're talking about today, actually, I mean, if you look at it in the more broad sense, this is physical evidence of innumerable religious and spiritual and oral traditions of a considerable number of different peoples, really. So there is the fact that this topic, this subject, is something that can actually fuel spiritual and oral traditions. And that may be one reason why the university circuit considers it a problem, because it would give people the motive to believe in things that they consider unreasonable. Again, the ultimate question that we need to be asking ourselves at this juncture in our history is, who tells us what to believe?
And you know what? And who is it? It's either the academics or it's the government. Two bodies that I wouldn't believe them these days if they told me the sky was blue. Because there's always some kind of agenda. There's some kind of whether they don't want us to know, they don't want to upset the apple cart, or they think we're too stupid to know the truth.
I think you can argue that even when they tell you the absolute truth, it's still part of an agenda.
Yeah,
it's not truth for the sake of truth anymore. It's if it's expedient to tell the truth rather than not tell the truth, then okay, this time we'll tell them the truth. But it's still part of the bigger plan. I take the word back, plan. I don't think there's any plan to any of this. I think it's just chaos. It's how I describe it, really. None of this is particularly well orchestrated or organised. It's just a mess, really.
Yes, I think there used to be a plan, but the plan is gone.
It's also, let's face the fact, we are a capitalistic culture. We survive to make money. And when we look for things, it's one thing to look for history and maybe some academic glory, but it also boils down to, you can't do it unless you get paid. So it's all money based, and if you find some discovery, who can you sell it to make money for it?
Yeah.
And if there's no interest in something, they're not going to spend the money on it.
Well, that's true, Mark. But the problem with ancient history studies today is it seems to be that, at least in some places, when you do it the wrong way, you stand to make more. Maybe we should begin to reward things for different reasons. Archaeological data that comes from a prehistoric site really belongs to everyone. It should be published in its most raw and complete format and left up to the individual to decide whether it's important to them.
I think the problem you have is informed knowledge. Can they make a decision based on a real understanding of the topic? And again, it depends what you want to feed people as to what's important information or not. So you get caught there as well, really.
So, Jason, we are coming up towards the end of the show here, and so let me ask you, Ages of the Giants, where can people find that book?
Right now it's on lulu.com.
Okay. Are there any plans for it to be expanded to bookstores, Amazon, or ebook purchases?
Yes, the distributors are going to be reviewing it soon, so it should pop up in some more places eventually. You can also follow me on Facebook. I make regular announcements on what's going on with the book and different things there.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned that you are working on a second book. What's going to be your focus on that particular book?
The second book is going to cover the time period where the first book ends in around 450 AD, and the second book is going to continue to chronicle the history of these people from that point all the way up to after European contact. And we are going to reveal their identity and their origins in the second book. It's going to incorporate linguistics, DNA, and ethnography, and a lot of different academic disciplines.
Now, are you also going to be looking at, is this still going to be focusing on the tall people, or are you also focusing on any other types of people? Because there are also the Native Americans talk about small people. Many Native American cultures talk about little people. There's in the Carolinas, there's the Cherokee little people that they talk about. And cultures all over the world talk about smaller types of human beings. Have you found any evidence for those?
Well, I think that would be a fascinating topic for someone who's interested. I mean, you can just look at the articles and the book that we've published and see how much evidence for the tall ones that exists. Who knows what's out there for other types of human beings. I think that the humanity's history is very Lord of the Rings. But in terms of evidence, there's actually an account in our book that was written by the first mayor of Charleston, West Virginia, of the excavation of one of these 7-foot tall Adena with a dwarf. So who can say? As for us, we'll probably continue to research only the tall ones and the cultures that they participated in, but listen, ancient history is fertile ground for investigation. Just because someone else has written a book about a subject does not mean by any means that there's no evidence to find or that there's not a breakthrough waiting to happen. I would encourage anyone listening to this who's interested in any of these topics to explore them.
Wow. Well, Jason, we've come to the end of the show. I just want to thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. This has been a very enlightening subject.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Absolutely fascinating. Yes, thank you.
Well, and thank you everyone for listening and to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio. We will be back next Wednesday night at 10 p.m., both Greenwich Mean and Eastern Time here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Have a great evening, anyone. And Andy, thanks again. Brilliant job as always.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it as always.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Night.